Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Elliot Gerson. Special thanks to Alma and Joe Gildenhorn, of course, for their generosity in supporting these book series. And delighted to see all of you here today. And as usual, we'll be filming this, so people who might be interested, please tell them to go to our website. You have Rosa Brooks's biography, I think, at your chairs. But for those especially who will just be watching, just a few words. She was a counselor for about 2 years for Michelle Flournoy at the Defense Department. She is a professor of law at Georgetown University. She's now actually serving as a dean for graduate studies at the law school. She's a senior fellow of New America. And she has very strong professional interests in human rights law. She has written an absolutely fascinating book that she rightly describes in it as part journalism, part policy, part history, part law, part anthropology, and with lots of fascinating stories in between. So it really is a remarkably broad book with many perspectives on the critical topics. And also fascinating, I think, and some of you in this room especially know this, is that she is the daughter of very well-known left-wing activists and anti-war protesters. She's also married to someone who's just retired after being an officer in Army Special Operations, a Green Beret. And I think, especially with this very fascinating background, it's really remarkable that this book has gotten, candidly, raves from people as disparate as generals, including Generals Petraeus and McChrystal, but also people that you could fairly describe as bridging a pretty broad spectrum ideologically, both in the military and civilian communities. So let me just start, for someone who, although you are also a journalist who might be writing about many of these topics for, say, the Yale Law Journal, why did you, and what in your Pentagon experience led you to write such a broad book, obviously for a general audience?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. It's terrific to be here. And I wrote this book rather than a Law Journal article, partly because I'd already written the Law Journal articles. In many ways, the germ of this book was a law review article I wrote in 2004. And here's the terrible, tragic thing about law review articles, which we law professors never like to admit: nobody reads them. If we're extraordinarily lucky, our tenure committee reads them or something like that. But the tip of, somebody did an unbelievably depressing study on law review articles and their citations and discovered that the typical law review article is cited by absolutely nobody. Mine was like in the world of law reviews, it was a stellar hit. I think it was cited by maybe a couple hundred people over 15 years. But obviously, if you want to reach a broader audience, if you care about the issues you're writing about, and I think this is a tension that many academics feel, you care passionately about the issues you're writing about, you may think to yourself, I just wrote the most brilliant law review article in the history of the world, and it will make absolutely no difference because no one has read it. So the issues I write about in the book are ones that I have been writing about in one way or another for almost 15 years now. And I wanted to see if I could engage a broader group of people than the typical two student law review editors and your mom who read your law review articles. I'm not even sure my mom read it, to be honest with you. She said she did, but also obviously because you think these topics deserve much broader attention than a narrow professional one. I do. I think that. Everybody knows the proverbial frog in the boiling water, and supposedly the frog never notices it's being boiled. Apparently that is not true. Frogs are smart enough to jump right out of the water when it starts getting uncomfortable. But I think that like the mythical frog, we Americans in post 9/11 America, the water has been getting hotter and hotter, and we haven't noticed. I think that the changes that the book talks about, the increasing blurriness around the blurriness of the boundaries between war and peace, is something that has happened in such a subtle way across so many different domains that we almost tend not to notice how radically the world is changing around us, but it is changing, and it's changing in ways that matter. They matter to us, they will matter to our children, they matter to the rest of the world. So to some extent, the book was my effort to ring some alarm bells.
So, I mean, the book, and even the title of the book, How Everything Became War and the Military Became Everything, there are really two themes there, in the title. And let's just start. You mentioned 9/11 with the How Everything Became War part. How important was 9/11 to that part of your thesis, or even language like the War on Terror?
Yeah.
Or was the water already boiling and we didn't notice it?
Yeah.
Or would it be boiling anyway?
I think it would be boiling anyway, but maybe it would be a slower boil. I think that 9/11 didn't create the world we live in now. It was symptomatic of broad trends that we would be seeing anyway. Even if Osama bin Laden got lucky on 9/11, no one would have imagined that the towers would collapse. If he hadn't gotten so lucky from his perspective and had done what he thought he was going to do, which is kill a couple hundred people, I think we would still mostly be where we are. I do think that 9/11 accelerated some trends. Ironically, the day before the September 11 attacks, on September 10th, 2001, George W. Bush was in Florida as part of a campaign against illiteracy. That's from the famous picture of him with the upside-down book. The poor guy was actually reading to school children as part of this campaign against illiteracy. Although I'm not his biggest fan, I've always felt a little sorry for him that he turned the book upside down at the crucial moment when the camera came in. So on September 10th, he gave a speech, and he said, "We are waging war on illiteracy." And of course, nobody thought he was going to, bomb illiteracy into submission or anything like that. Day later, we're in a war on terrorism, and I think it could be anything. Civilian jetliners, little tiny groups of people. And when you begin to think of the world as a world in which the next threat could come from anywhere and be anything, could be a bioengineered virus, could be a cyber attack, could be another terror attack using non-traditional weapons. Well, if the threat can come from anywhere and be anything, then the military, which is a kind of can-do institution and says our job is to protect the United States, the military is going to start saying, gosh, we've got to do everything everywhere. And that is, in fact, what we have seen. We have seen gradually a trend towards, this was one of the things that kind of blew my mind when I got to the Pentagon. Pick an issue, any issue that you might be concerned about in the world, and somewhere in the military, someone is working on it, whether it's trying to end human trafficking in the Pacific, or reduce violence against women in Congo, or come up with a better system for vaccinating cattle in Botswana. Someone is going to be working on it, because when everything is potentially war, everything is a job for the military.
So in your experience in the Pentagon, did you find that the military, I don't know if it's fair to ask this question in the general way, do they relish vaccinating cattle in Botswana? What about their attitude to this incredibly expanding job description?
I think, as your question suggests, the answer, it depends who you ask. I think that there were people, and there are people within the military who really embrace that, who say, yes, it's a complicated world. Threats come packaged in all kinds of ways, and we can't afford to say, oh, all we do is shoot. We blow stuff up and we break things. That's all we do. That if we're serious about protecting the nation, then we have to get serious about developing all of these capabilities that may look non-traditional, but they're still important. And there's no one else who can do them at the moment. There's another story is what's happened to the civilian institutions. There's no one else to do them, so we embrace it, because our fundamental mission is not driving tanks or shooting rifles. Our fundamental mission is protecting the United States of America, and this is part of that. That being said, I think that equally there are still very powerful forces within the military who say, this is crazy. This is not what we're supposed to do. This is not what we want to do. It's not what we're trained to do. We're diffusing the effort to become people who are adept at doing everything everywhere is only going to degrade our ability to do what is our fundamental mission, which is warfighting. And this is really dangerous.
Well, What about the argument that part of it is just politics and the budgetary process and the fact that repeatedly the American public shows more respect for the military than any other institution, point one. And point two, it's a lot easier to get Congress to appropriate money to the military than it is to foreign aid to vaccinate in Botswana or to combat human trafficking. Is that part of it?
I think that is definitely part of it, and every year Gallup does this poll asking about confidence in public institutions, and Americans say, you know, we hate Congress, we don't really like the presidency, we're not so keen on the court, but the military, 70+% of Americans say year in, year out, they have tremendous confidence in the U.S. military, professionalism, integrity, et cetera. That has further reinforced a trend that was already there, which is, you know, if you're a politician, I honestly think if you could take a live service member and pin them to your lapel, that would probably be happening right now. And we've got we have this sort of rather strange spectacle in the recent debates where Donald Trump says, I have 88 generals who support me, and then Hillary Clinton says, I have 92, you know, and no question, we have reached a point where the way you get anything funded or you give legitimacy to any cause, whether your cause is an anti-obesity campaign, a campaign against torture, or your partisan political campaign, if you can find some people either preferably wearing a uniform or recently out of a uniform, that's the way you get stuff funded.
Let's just talk about wearing a uniform. What you wrote in the book, most Americans know as much about the military as they know about the surface of the moon. Now, you and we often talk about, especially after the draft is gone, about 1% of the population go in the military. So many people, they're either in that world or they're not. You had an interest in these issues as a human rights lawyer, but candidly, how much did you know about the military before you married it?
Nothing. Not that much. No, I again, coming from a left-wing background. Hey, Tim Noah. I'm just smiling at somebody in the audience. Coming from a left-wing background, I think I grew, my mother had the "war is not the answer" bumper sticker in her car, and I think if you had asked my 10-year-old self what should be done with the military, I would have said, disband it. We don't need it. It's a terrible thing. Who would want it? I think for me, the shift in my own thinking about the military came only in the mid-1990s, and I think for my parents' generation, the sort of the paradigm of a military conflict was Vietnam, with all the problems and turmoil and abuses that went with that. For my generation, in some ways, the paradigm was the ethnic conflicts in the Balkans, in Rwanda, and elsewhere in the 1990s, where after all my life thinking, oh, the military is just a bad thing, then when you saw these terrible conflicts that were killing so many innocent people, that in the Balkans, U.S. NATO military force did play an important role in bringing an end to atrocities and ethnic cleansing. In Rwanda, it didn't, but maybe it could have. But that really forced me to re-examine some of my own assumptions, and working at the State Department in the late 1990s, and working in places like Kosovo and Sierra Leone brought me for the first time into personal contact with members of the military, and sort of pushed me both to understand that institution more, understand that culture more, and begin to see it as an institution that was a lot more complicated than I had thought.
It's fair to say, the book is overwhelmingly one written with enormous respect for the military. So it is very interesting to see how your own personal experience affected all of this. Let's go back to this how everything became war point. And you write about how obviously most of law is based on a clear division between war and peace, or as I think you describe it, between war and not war.
Yeah.
And obviously whether it's war or whether it's not war has profound implications on rights of privacy, on other kinds of rights, and even, obviously ultimately taking another life.
Right.
In one context, it's murder, and in many states you can be executed, and in another context you can get a medal for it.
Right.
But then we're in a world where you can, push a button and someone in, not wearing a uniform, driving a truck in Somalia can have a Predator missile blow them up. So what are the implications, and this is obviously, again, another big topic in the book, of the fact that distinction, it's not there anymore. It's not like soldiers wearing uniforms and a declaration of war and an armistice, and things are fine here and not fine there.
Yeah, for me, one of the most fun parts of researching and writing the book was looking at the sort of anthropological evidence of the ways in which different human societies have in different ways, but really quite consistently, historically, tried to draw a sharp line between war and warriors versus civilians and ordinary life, and we all do so for the reasons you said, that in wartime, behavior that we consider immoral and illegal in peacetime is acceptable and in fact praiseworthy. The Navajo Indians in the American Southwest literally would distinguish the line between war and peace with an actual line and an actual different language, that they would had a different dialect that was spoken by warriors setting out on raids. And when the men returned from the raid, they would draw a line in the desert sand, face enemy territory, turn around, face their home territory, step over the line, and resume the normal dialect. And there are countless examples of everything from, face painting and different music and sort of the ritual ways we try to sort of police that line, because it's so important. Because everything depends on it. Many Native American groups also even had literally different government forms for wartime and peacetime. They would have a war chief and a peace chief. So in time of war, ordinarily you have chief is whoever, and then in time of war, that chief would step aside, a war chief would take over, and then when the war was done, you go back to the peace chief. So even the very nature and locus of government would change. The trouble, of course, right now is that if you have a war on terrorism, or even a war on Al-Qaeda and its associated forces, or a cyber war, pretty much by definition, you can't define the battlefield geographically. It becomes almost impossible to put boundaries around a war in space or in time. We don't know what counts as a weapon anymore. Is it a civilian jet, hijacked civilian jet? Is it a line of computer code? Could it be a bioengineered virus? We don't know who counts as part of a war. We don't know who's a soldier anymore. Is it a financier for ISIS? Is it a Russian oil engineer who's operating captured Syrian oil fields? So our problem right now is that we have this kind of binary legal framework. We have one set of rules, the law of armed conflict, that applies when there's an armed conflict. Problem is, the only thing the law of armed conflict never defines is what counts as an armed conflict. So we have one set of rules that is pretty permissive in terms of the state's use of violence, coercion, surveillance, censorship, secrecy, lack of accountability, and we apply that set of rules in wartime to armed conflicts, and we're okay with that greater tolerance of violence and secrecy and so on because we think of wars as bounded in space and in time, as they're exceptions to the norm. But when we can't tell the difference anymore, when it gets harder and harder to say, oh, here's where the war is, here's when it started, here's when it might end, and here's who is a combatant in that war, then all these incredibly important questions become impossible to answer in any principled way, ranging from, when can a government have secret laws or secret actions? What should be subject to judicial review? What doesn't have to be? When can you monitor and surveil your citizens, and when is that not okay? Who can you detain for how long, with what degree of due process, and ultimately, as you say, who lives and who dies? You can't answer those questions anymore.
Just to give you a flavor of how I think beautifully the book is written too, I'm just going to quote on this point that you were just mentioning. You say, "I'm sure his intentions are good," and you're referring to President Obama's. Then you say, "But good intentions notwithstanding, we now have a state of affairs in which our government, the government of a democratic nation that was founded on the premise that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including the rights to life and liberty, is claiming for itself the power to kill any person, anywhere on earth, at any time, without express congressional approval, based on information that is secret and has been collected and evaluated according to secret criteria by anonymous individuals in a secret procedure." And then you say, anyone who thinks this is consistent with American values should go back and reread the Declaration of Independence. And then you say, but we should also keep in mind that there has been no year except 2001 in which terrorism has killed more American citizens than lightning strikes. Do we really need to toss 200 plus years of American values out the window? Pretty strong question. But what is, I mean, it's easy to say that, maybe not that eloquently, but what is the answer? I mean, if given the nature of war today and the asymmetry of it, and the fact that, you know, someone can in fact cause mass atrocities acting in a failed state somewhere halfway around the world.
Yeah, so one of the arguments of the book is that we're stuck with this sort of binary legal framework in a non-binary world. You know, our legal framework is on-off. Either you're in a war, in which case you can kill people without any due process, you can have secrecy, surveillance, you don't have to have the normal checks and balances of the democratic process, or you're not in a war, in which case it's warrants, it's courts, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't leave us a lot of options in a world in which threats don't come neatly packaged in one category or the other. And I think what ends up happening, and you've all seen this in the last 15 years, is that the debates very quickly kind of fall victim to this sort of circular stuff where you know, one set of people will say, you know, human rights folks will say something like, it's terrible, this drone strike, there's no due process, there should be some due process. And then the executive branch and its defenders will say, don't be ridiculous, you can't have courts on the battlefield, everybody knows that. And of course, if your framework for thinking, if your model, your paradigm for thinking about war is, you know, the beaches at Normandy or something like that, then everybody totally gets that. You can't have a court on the beach at Normandy, it doesn't make any sense. And from a legal perspective, right, from a legal perspective, if the law of war is the right framework for thinking about US targeted strikes, say a drone strike against a suspected terrorist in Yemen or something like that, if that's the right framework, then that drone strike is just the lawful wartime targeting of an enemy combatant, and it is morally and legally indistinguishable from an American soldier on the beach at Normandy shooting at a German rushing towards him with a machine gun. There's nothing different. On the other hand, if we don't think it's an armed conflict or we don't think that person's a combatant, then it's just a murder. And we really want to know the difference. But in that in-between space, and one of the arguments of the book is that we're operating in that space between more and more. We're likely to operate in that space between for the foreseeable future. And we have to figure out how to do that operationally. We also have to figure out how to do that legally in a way that's consistent both with our strategic goals and with our values. And there's no, the sort of the argument of, well, you can't have a court on a battlefield, everybody knows that. Okay, sure. But when it comes to things like targeted strikes, you know, drone hands become the kind of shorthand, even though not all of them involve drones and so forth. But when it comes to drone strikes, very often the United States is tracking that target for weeks or months or even years. We know who that person is. We know where they went to high school. We know their wife's name and their children's name.
The book starts with an incident
The book starts with, yeah, and it's not a situation where there's chaos all around you and bullets are flying everywhere, and of course you couldn't possibly have time to talk to a court. We've got oodles of time, not always, but mostly, and you know, there are always exceptions, but frequently, of course there would be time for a judicial process. All the reasons that in the classic law of war framework we don't have that don't actually exist. So part of the argument of the book is that we've been kind of trapped by the legal paradigms we've created, and are suffering from a sort of massive collective failure of the imagination to say, yeah, we've got all this stuff, all these threats that don't fall neatly into those categories, so let's come up with a set of rules and institutions that we believe both help us achieve our security objectives and are consistent with our values for dealing with those things. And I don't think that's impossible, or in some cases even all that hard.
But secrecy is still critical, isn't it? I mean, how could you do some of those things when there is a very bad guy out there driving a truck in Somalia or Yemen, and we know he's a bad guy? How much due process can there be before we give up any realistic opportunity to take him out?
But I think we do face that problem in ordinary life too, right? I mean, if we have a very, very bad guy who is a criminal, and getting a warrant doesn't mean that you put on the front page of the newspaper, we're coming to get you at the following address at the following time. So to me that doesn't seem like a big barrier. I mean, we already have mechanisms both within the judicial branch and within the government more generally to protect information that is sensitive or classified, or to reveal it only when it is safe to do so and won't actually jeopardize an operation. So I think there's a big difference between the level of secrecy that is necessary to protect an operation and ensure its success, and to protect sensitive sources and so forth, versus the level of secrecy that is necessary on an ongoing basis. And I think that, and this is a much broader problem, but I think that, and this is also not a broad and not a new problem, I do think that our government tends to greatly overclassify, and quite a lot of things that could, without any jeopardy to national security, be put in the public domain remain in that murky, classified world more or less indefinitely.
Well, we may come back to that, and also definitely to the drone war, but a couple of other areas of where there's this increasing blurriness compared to this very simple black-white world I think we all thought used to exist between the military and civilian, and between war and not war. And that's the blurring between civilian intelligence personnel and uniformed military personnel that we have now, especially in the context of things like drone wars. How problematic is that?
It's problematic because we have a legal framework that says you're not supposed to do that, and in fact I think we're increasingly, any given operation has a mixture of civilian intelligence agency employees, military personnel, and often civilian contractors working under contract with either the military or a civilian intelligence agency. And when you're operating with this binary framework, I think we actually are putting our people in a lot of legal jeopardy. The very same reasons that the Bush administration said after 9/11, Al-Qaeda is not entitled to the protections of the Geneva Conventions because they are not complying with the rules. Some of the rules say things like, you have to wear a uniform to be considered a combatant who's entitled to POW status if you're captured, for instance. Or that if you're a civilian, you can't be targeted by an opposing force. But if you directly participate in hostilities, you can. By mixing all that stuff up, we're making many of our own people, I think, subject both to targeting and to potential prosecution criminal prosecution in courts of other states, which I'm not sure we really want to be doing. But I also think it just further blurs those lines. Is this a military operation? Is this an intelligence operation? What is this, a law enforcement operation? Exactly what is it? And in fact, a final piece, I also think there's been a little bit of game playing, kind of a executive branch forum shopping with some particular operations where, depending on whether you think that the intelligence committees in Congress or the armed services committees are going to smile more upon your operation, you kind of say, let's put nominally the CIA person in charge of this, or let's put the Air Force person in charge of this, even though it may be the same team either way. So that has also, I think, been going on a bit, making it harder for Congress to exercise meaningful oversight.
another footnote, perhaps, in terms of blurring that you talk about too, which I really hadn't thought about in this context before, is the militarization of police forces in the United States. So it even carries over in that direction. And you want to just talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, there's a section of the book, brief section, that talks about what I call trickle-down war, and the ways in which the habits and practices associated with war kind of trickle down into ordinary judicial proceedings, ordinary policing, and other aspects of ordinary life. And it's a hard one to talk about because I think the causation is difficult to untangle, and I think that they can be almost invisible effects, but they range from things like the migration of judicial doctrines like the state secrets privilege, or judicial practices like allowing hearings in which some evidence is kept classified as not revealed to both parties, or non-public hearings. We're seeing that kind of thing kind of spread into private litigation out of the national security litigation where it was created. But I think we also see it in terms of policing in a couple different ways. One is just quite literally the surplus military equipment from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq has been made available to municipal police forces, heavily subsidized through Homeland Security grants. And so we're literally seeing police who look more like the military, driving vehicles that seem more military, wearing uniforms that look more military, carrying weapons that are more military. And we're seeing kind of creeping of technologies. We saw that in Dallas, where a robot was used to kill the Dallas gunman, for instance. We saw it in Baltimore, where they were experimenting with surveillance technologies pioneered for military purposes, where you can essentially look at the entire city and rewind to see where cars go and where people have gone before a crime was committed. I think we're also seeing the spread of some paramilitary tactics within police. I mean, SWAT teams were created originally for, again, exceptional situations, the hostage rescue or terrorist incidents. But once you create it, it's kind of the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If you create it, you will use it. So then you've got these nicely outfitted SWAT teams, and there aren't enough hostage scenarios and terrorist incidents to keep them busy. So you start using them to serve high-risk warrants and in drug arrests. And so you begin to see, again, the institutions created, and institutions and rules created for the exception begin to kind of become the norm.
Let's get back to the drone war, which features in much of the book. I don't know that any of us, well, you may, and if you did, you probably can't tell us, but how big and extensive is this war? And it seems that, it obviously saves us money. It is politically much easier to wage. It is, other than the fact that we know, and there's acknowledgement of civilians being killed, but there seems to be much less of that than might be in other forms of warfare. How much should we worry about this thing that's going on every day that we really don't know very much about?
I think we should worry a lot. And I think we should be worried for at least three slightly different reasons. First, and in some ways most profoundly from my perspective, just as an American citizen, it's sort of shocking to me that we have essentially alongside the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have what amounts to a third secret war that's been going on for the last 10 plus years. And that war, to the best of our knowledge, and the problem is it's a secret war, so we don't know that much about it, has killed at least 4,000 people, maybe as many as 5,000 or 6,000 people. This is largely the drone war, although to some limited extent it's special operations raids and so forth. It's killed people in half a dozen different countries, none of which we have been at war at or in a traditional sense. And it's just kind of shocking to me that lethal force carried out on that scale is not formally acknowledged. And to date, the U.S. government has only formally acknowledged a tiny fraction of those strikes. And the rest of them, we still get the can neither confirm nor deny that this has occurred. I do find that kind of shocking. And, you know, take the Iraq War. We love it or hate it, right? George W. Bush George Bush said, I'm going to war in Iraq. He didn't say, I can neither confirm nor deny that we are going to war in Iraq. You know, so whether you loved it or hated it, you could love it or hate it openly, and you had stuff to kind of sink your teeth into and argue about. But what's really sort of chilling to me as a citizen about the drone war is you can't, you know, where do you argue when the government keeps saying we can neither confirm or deny that's happening? So that's one. I think the other two things that are very troubling to me, one is strategic. I am very far from convinced that this approach has made us safer. I'm not sure it is cheaper in the long run. I think that there is, again, it's hard to evaluate because it's secret, but to the extent that I'm able to get any information, mostly from NGOs and journalistic reporting, I think there is a good reason to think that, if anything, it is causing more extremist sentiment, anti-American extremist sentiment, and helping recruiting efforts by extremist groups. And then third, I worry very, very much about the international precedents that we're setting. And you quoted a passage in the book earlier. You know, I think when Vladimir Putin decides to take out the next political opponent, whether it's with a drone strike or a
whether it's with polonium 210 in the sushi,
precisely,
as it was with Litvinenko
in London a few years ago. It's really hard for us to say, well, you shouldn't do that. That wasn't a terrorist. That was a dissident. And if Putin says, I beg to differ, I have evidence that unfortunately is classified and I can't share with you. I'm sure you understand. It's a war. That was a combatant. You know, what can we say?
So I mean, you are very concerned that it could come back to bite us. And you know, there was a lot of publicity here in Washington recently, you know, about the Orlando Letelier killing. You know, you can almost see Sheridan Circle from here in 1976, and the absolute horror that another government, in that case the Chilean government, could murder someone, you know, in another country. And, you know, how far-fetched is it to say that we are doing similar things today?
We are. If from the perspective of the Augusto Pinochet regime in Chile, Letelier was a combatant in a war. Their war was with terrorists and communists, but they saw him as an enemy combatant, and they said essentially what we are saying today, or they would have if anybody had, you know, been able to eavesdrop on them at the time, which is, well, he's an enemy combatant in an armed conflict that we're waging, which knows no geographical boundaries. The conflict is where the combatants are. And the United States, well, we understand it's a sovereign country, but sometimes sovereign countries are unable or unwilling to take appropriate action to address a threat to our national security. And under those circumstances, we're obviously compelled to take action ourselves. And that has essentially been the U.S. argument as well. And I think it's a very unstable world that you usher in when you start saying, okay, that's all right, that's okay. Everybody gets to say that. There's no obvious end to that.
And might this relate to the current issue with the override of the president's veto in terms of suing Saudi officials? I mean, and the fact that, you know, citizens in Pakistan or Yemen or Somalia could turn around and sue us for, well, I mean,
Yeah, no, I mean, and this one, I think President Obama was probably on the conservative side here of saying it's probably not a good idea to give further support to arguments that each state unilaterally can sort of jurisdictionally reach the officials and citizens of every other state when it decides to do so, because that's a recipe for a good deal of instability.
Someone features in this book whom I'd never heard of, and I won't be able to pronounce his name either, and that's Gerson Erdemovich. Why do you write so much about him and then even return to him at the end of the book?
So this is it's partly just because it's a story that always fascinated me, and it's a story in some ways that's so rich in terms of its implications for how we think about law and war, and the degree to which law can tame war. So Drazen Erdemovich, I have no idea if I'm pronouncing his name right either, he's this young, he's actually of Croatian ethnic origin, and he, during the 1990s in the war in Bosnia, he ends up in the Bosnian Serb army, which is a very bad group of people to end up in. He does not give a hoot about Bosnian Serb nationalist ideology. He was actually, I think, married to someone of different ethnicity. He had tried to get out, couldn't get out, he just wanted a job, his wife was pregnant. And he ends up being ordered in the summer of 1994. His whole detachment is ordered to a farm outside the city of Srebrenica. And nobody tells them what they're there to do. They're just told, wait here. And then a bunch of buses pull up, and young men and boys and men are led off with their arms tied behind their back, and his commander says, okay, now we're going to shoot them. And this, of course, you all know what I'm referring to. The massacre at Srebrenica ends up killing about 8,000 civilians in a couple of days. And so Erdemovich, alone amongst his unit, tries to protest, and he says, we can't, are you crazy? We can't do that. They're civilians. We can't shoot them. And his commander says to him, well, you can shoot them, or you can give me your gun and you can go stand with them and we'll shoot you. And so Erdemovich does probably what most of us would do, although most of us would probably wish that we wouldn't do this, but most of us would probably do just what he did. He kind of goes, okay, all right. And so he participates in the massacre, although he says he tried not to aim at the very young people, and he estimates that he probably killed 70 to 100 people at the end of the day. And when the war ends, he pretty much turns himself in. I mean, it's kind of a complicated story, but he's sort of tortured by this, and he ends up telling his story to a British journalist, and he basically says, arrest me, I've committed this terrible war crime. And he ends up, after a long series of events, he ends up at The Hague, where he becomes... Unlike all of his bosses. He or certainly at that point in time, he becomes the first person tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity by the Hague Tribunal. And of course the judges in the tribunal are kind of like, he's a private, and the last thing they want to do is go after this they want to go after the leaders, but they've got this guy and he's saying, I killed 100 innocent civilians, try me. And so they try him, and he pleads guilty to war crimes and crimes against humanity charges. He's convicted, he's sentenced to a prison term, and at his plea hearing, or the equivalent, the Hague process, when he's asked, did you plead guilty or not guilty, he says, Your Honor, I'm guilty, but I just want to say that I had to do it because they would have killed me if I hadn't. And so then later on appeal, he gets a different lawyer who says, well, he shouldn't have pled guilty. It should have been a plea of not guilty by reason of duress. And there ends up being this sort of elaborate appellate process to decide whether duress is a complete defense to charges of war crimes or crimes against humanity, or whether it's just you're guilty, but it's a mitigating circumstance, so you might get a lesser. Is it, do you get to say not guilty by reason of duress, or do you say guilty, but maybe give me a lesser sentence because I was under duress? And it becomes this kind of fascinating legal opinions, and because you can see that all of the judges are just tormented by this as much as he was, in a sense, and are really struggling with, on the one hand, if we say it's not a defense, then are we saying that we're expecting him to have acted like a martyr? Should he have martyred himself? He would have been killed. They completely accept that he's telling the truth, and he would have been killed, or he believed he would have been killed. And so on the one hand, they recognize that saying, too bad, you're guilty, even though you would have been killed, is that expecting him to behave in ways that it's really just unreasonable to expect anyone to behave. But on the other hand, they sort of go, hey, if you could be exonerated, this guy killed 100 people, and maybe he should have been killed. Maybe it would have been. Maybe we do think that the right thing to do is say, yeah, okay, this is it. I would rather you kill me, and it becomes this kind of fascinating struggle on the part of the the judges to figure out what's the point of law in these horrific situations. You know, is it to be convenient? Is it to have a set of rules that are practical, that we think can be followed? Or is the point of law instead to make a sort of a moral statement about the kind of world that we want to live in? And I think that the reason that I have always been fascinated by this case and talk about it in the book is that it ends up being this very profound argument about law's purpose. And very narrowly, the appeals court comes down on the side of saying duress is not a complete defense. It may be a mitigating circumstance, but law must come down on the side of what is right. Even, you know, it's a sort of let justice be done though the heavens fall kind of argument. It's very moving, and I try, I don't know how successfully, to sort of link it back at the end of the book to, as we look forward, as we look at our legal frameworks, we get into these very legalistic discussions where we sort of say things like, well, does law tolerate this, does law permit this? And we spend a lot of time talking about what the law permits and so forth, and we often forget that the law is a vehicle that we use to create the kind of world we want to live in. It's not just this technical set of rules. So I bring it back at the end to try to make that point.
Where is he now?
He is in the international equivalent of witness protection. He served his sentence, and he is living under a different identity after years on suicide watch. Essentially, he was, you know. And I actually would love to know exactly what kind of life he's living, but I don't.
Just a couple more questions, and then I'm going to open it up, as we always do, to your questions in just a few minutes. Solutions to this dilemma of the blurring, the expansion, and you talk about that some, but I guess you could have, you know, the war on terror could end. We all hope it does, but it's not going to happen anytime soon. You talk about, well, can you jam war back into a box, I think, as you put it, and have clear lines? Or do you just accept the fact that the world we live in is blurry and develop rules around that? And while you talk about that, the other interesting thing is that you suggest that will help is you're a proponent for mandatory service. And many in this room will know that we at Aspen have a connection to the notion of something close to mandatory service. Actually, Stan McChrystal would like it to be mandatory. Politically, that's not going to happen. But we launched something here called the Franklin Project, that's now the Service Year Alliance, working toward essentially an expectation that every young American would have a year of service, civilian or military. And so maybe start with that and then talk more about where do we go from here? What are the implications of this? What is it about mandatory service that attracts you, and how does it relate to the themes of the book?
So I think it goes back to something that we talked about briefly earlier, the sort of cultural gap between civilians and the military in modern America. And I think that the fact that so few Americans have direct knowledge of how the military works, who's in it, what that culture is like, has meant that most civilians both lack the knowledge and the confidence to raise hard questions that they should be raising about everything from military budgets to the policy decisions and the legal decisions that are framing our world, some of the things that we've talked about, including these decisions about what do we call war, what do we choose to put in that war box in the first place, what tasks do we give the military, what tasks should we give the military, that the fact that so few people, we in post 9/11 America, support for the troops has become our civil religion. And it's not a good thing. You know, this is an institution made up of human beings that is sent out to do things that other human beings tell them to do, and there's nothing sacred about it, there's nothing magic about it. I have lots of respect for the military as an institution, but it is not perfect, and not everything it does is perfect, and the fact that something is part of the military budget doesn't mean it should be sacrosanct, and the fact that something involves U.S. troops does not mean that we should not be able to ask critical questions all the time. So I think that knowledge gap is a problem with the kind of reflexive, I support the troops, so it becomes a way to shut down conversations that need to happen. How do you solve that? I think there's this, it's funny, there's this kind of there's this kind of weird national mythology that has grown up in which we hearken back to World War II as sort of the glory days, the good old days, leaving aside the fact that, you know, scores of millions of people were dying. We're sort of like, oh, things were so great back in World War II when we had a draft. And so the, you know, Iowa farm boy and the Texas cowboy and the Italian kid from Brooklyn were all thrown together, and they became friends, and they learned that they were all Americans, and wasn't that wonderful? And everybody knew about the military, and so in the post-war era, everybody understood the military. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have that again? And leaving aside the small fact that this nostalgia is sort of premised on this mass carnage moment in American in world history, we don't need a draft right now. We don't need a draft. Wouldn't make any sense to have a draft. And in fact, the World War II era was sort of aberrational for most of American history. The military has been very small and very professionalized and very separate from the rest of society, and I don't think that's always a bad thing. I think it's become a bad thing at a moment when those boundaries have blurred and the military's role has expanded so much. Then it's a bad thing when ordinary people don't know anything about it. I think that the idea of a kind of revamped, modernized universal service, one that would bring young Americans into a system where some of them would be doing military service, some would be doing more Peace Corps or AmeriCorps or Vista-like tasks, I think is one of the vehicles through which you might get back to a state where there is greater and more widespread societal familiarity with the military and less kind of meaningless glorification without much knowledge. And I actually am a huge fan of the McChrystal-led project that you guys have been supporting, and think that a lot of the arguments that are often made against the economic feasibility of universal service are very short-sighted, because I think in addition to all the benefits I just mentioned, I think that level of investment in young Americans, in infrastructure, in our own cities, et cetera, would pay off many, many times in the future.
What about any other, you know, policy implications for the problems you describe in the book?
The book ends by arguing that we are, whether we like it or not, we're operating in this in-between space between sort of traditional war and traditional peace, and that we just have to accept that and get used to it and figure out how to operate there. And from a military perspective, what does that mean? How would we need to rethink how we recruit, how we train, how we equip the military itself, but also rethinking some of the legal and institutional structures that we have. And as I said earlier, this would require some radical changes, but nothing that is impossible. From a legal perspective, for instance, as I said, you know, there is no inherent reason that you couldn't have more judicial or quasi-judicial process for determining when you should use lethal force in a foreign sovereign country. You know, that the logistical reasons that we think of all have to do with a sort of model of armed conflict that isn't most of the time what we're actually dealing with. So it's certainly not impossible. I think it's more of a failure of political imagination to say, oh yeah, okay, so if we expect that we're going to, in future decades, continue to be needing to sometimes use lethal force against non-traditional threats or surveillance or detention, let's come up with a set of rules that we think both acknowledges the legitimate government need to take action at times, but that is also consistent with our values. And I don't think that's, I think it's hard but not impossible. And I think institutionally, if we think that the military, and we haven't talked about this piece as much, but if we think that the military in the foreseeable future will continue to be called upon to engage in all these non-traditional kinds of activities, then let's take that seriously and let's do what we have to do to make sure that military personnel do have the training and the oversight mechanisms to do those things well and do them responsibly and accountably. And that too, hard but not impossible.
Thank you. And let me open it up. And again, this is all taped, so we wait for the microphone. First, in the back. Yes, please. Just your name and question, and we'll continue around the room.
Hi, my name is Mark. Thanks so much. I was wondering if you could talk about, for younger generations, how to make an impact. And I want to use human rights in Africa as a model. So you've got President Bush, you've got Samantha Power, Gail Smith, Susan Rice criticizing, and then he abstains from an ICC indictment of a sitting head of state. Massive support for the largest peacekeeping force in Darfur in humanitarian aid. And then you've got Samantha, Susan Rice, Gail Smith, and Obama. And then in the New York Times book review of your book, she bemoans how she can't even get access. And so I'm wondering if people who want to follow in your and Samantha's footsteps make a difference, it seems like, perhaps oversimplified, it's better to make a difference outside and criticize the administration than to be inside and to try to make a difference that way. So I'm curious on your thoughts.
She couldn't get the access with her earlier job.
I think the world needs both, and it's hard to do both at once, right? It's impossible to do both at once, but I think that the world needs people on the outside, making noises and waving signs around and generally being a nuisance, because being a nuisance sometimes forces policymakers to pay attention to things that they don't want to pay attention to. I also think that being on the outside, insiders can get real tunnel vision, that the adage of, where you sit is where you stand, and when you're the ambassador to UN, you find yourself championing a different set of causes than when you're a journalist writing books about genocide, right? And that's inevitable. That we're all human beings, we feel loyalty to the people we work with every day, we take them seriously, so I think outsiders are really important, banging on the gates and making a lot of noise and being a nuisance. I also think that there's a limit to what outsiders can accomplish, and that the knowledge, the relationships of how things work, how the sausage is made, where the actual decision-making authority lies, that you get from being on the inside is vital, and certainly having been on both the inside and the outside, I'm sort of acutely aware of the limits of both of those roles, but I do believe very deeply that we need both. And if you're thinking about your own career, I don't think that there's a right or wrong way to do it. I think that it is useful to have a little bit of the experience of both, so that hopefully you can kind of capture what's helpful in each experience. I mean, I do tell my NGO friends and my journalist friends, yeah, go work in the government, at least for a little while. You will learn things you didn't imagine. It will change the way you do your activism or journalism when you're back on the outside. And I tell my friends in government, go be on the outside for a little while. It will change your assumptions about what is possible and what is not, what is obvious and what is not. So no real answer, except that both roles have built-in limits, but we need people to be in both of them.
Okay, the gentleman right on the aisle.
Thank you. I'm Charles Cobb. I have a question about the military mindset. In the 70s, there was a book published, I think it was called Military Music is to Music What Military Justice is to Justice. And I have a friend who graduated from one of the service academies who then went to military flight school, and one of the things that was drilled into him was the phrase, "Don't think you'll weaken the team." That's probably relevant if you're flying a fast jet, but maybe not in other contexts. So my question is the military mindset impervious to civilian control and oversight? Thank you.
I don't think so. So I think the military is large and is not actually all that homogeneous. And I think in some ways, interestingly, some of the liveliest discussions of that space between and the legal, moral, and institutional challenges it poses are occurring within the military itself, partly because those are the people who've been asked to figure it all out, right, and nobody else really cares. So I think that on the one hand, there are some really interesting and very creative and very brave discussions going on within the military right now. about some of these issues. On the other hand, the military, even those within it, whether they're senior or junior, who want to change things, are very limited by an institutional structure that was sort of designed to be resistant to change in a lot of ways. And I got myself into a little bit of hot water a few years ago by writing a column that was sort of largely tongue-in-cheek, but not completely tongue-in-cheek, in which I argued that the U.S. military should stop focusing on recruiting young men at American high schools and should instead focus on recruiting senior citizens at the annual AARP conference. And everybody kind of was like, that's stupid. Don't, you're ridiculous. What do you know? But my point was a serious one, which is that we already have a military. Only 85% of our military personnel are in combat occupational specialties. Granted, you can be a cook or a photographer and run over an IED or get ambushed, but already we have a military in which we formally acknowledge that most people aren't learning to do combat. That's not what they're going to do. Even of the people in combat occupational specialties, only about half ended up being deployed despite 15 years of war. And of those who deployed, an amazing percentage of them didn't actually end up doing anything that we traditionally think of as fighting. And I had an interesting conversation a few years ago when I was talking to a bunch of smart young majors at the Army's School of Advanced Military Studies, and I said, how would you define a soldier? What makes a soldier a soldier? And they all started coming up with things about, fighting. And I said, okay, most of you just come back from deployments in Iraq or Afghanistan. What were you doing? And they started saying things like, well, I was working with sanitation engineers to improve the city sanitation, or I was, trying to do micro-enterprise loans with Afghan women or whatever. And I said, and do you still think of yourselves as soldiers? And they all kind of went like, gee, we still recruit and train much the same way we did in the 19th century. We still recruit young men because our model for what we think they're going to do is they're going to be carrying really heavy loads and getting into firefights and marching long distances. And some of them still do have to do that, right? It still happens. It's not going away. Traditional old-fashioned bloody war is not going away. But these days, most of them aren't doing that. They're never going to do that. We don't want them to do that. We want them to be setting up micro-enterprise loan programs for Afghan women, or training Iraqi parliamentarians. And if those are the tasks that increasingly our military is doing and that we think we want them to be doing in the future, it's not clear that your target demographic should be 18 to 24-year-old young men, right? They've got lots of great things about your typical 18 to 24-year-old male, but being an expert on governance or economic development that's not going to be their strength. So if we were to get serious about creating a military that had the capabilities to do the tasks that it's doing, and is probably going to be doing, we would really need to quite radically rethink how we recruit, the degree to which we let people go in and out of the military and the private sector without doing great damage to their own career paths, how we train people. And I do think that there's a lot of cultural reluctance in the military to do that. And I also remember a conversation I had when I was at the Pentagon with General Keith Alexander, who at the time was not only was heading the NSA, but was standing up the then new U.S. Cyber Command. And there had been a lot of media backlash to the creation of Cyber Command, saying, it's militarizing cyberspace, with all these cyber warriors you're always talking about. And I said to General Alexander, yeah, well, maybe we should stop using the term cyber warrior because it feeds into this fear that cyberspace is being militarized. And he said, and it was fair enough, he said, I'm trying to convince all these 18-year-old boys to do this. And if I say, I would like to recruit you to be paid very little to sit at a desk and look at a computer screen all day, they're not going to join. But if I tell them they're going to be cyber warriors, they will. So, I recognize that there is a kind of, our sense of, the sense of identity is so powerfully linked to traditional models of conflict that there is some resistance to change.
Joe, and then get to you after. And then I haven't seen any questions on this side. It's not just that I'm looking this way. So,
Joe Gildenhorn, having been drafted way back the olden days, I think it was a positive experience, and I think if we had universal military training, it would be terrific. I question whether we have the finances to afford such an operation. I may point out that we have Mrs. Sager, who is the wife of the Swiss ambassador, and having been in Switzerland, they do have universal training, and it works pretty well. Anyway, my thought is that we really don't have the finances to do this.
When you think about, though, the amount of money that we currently plow into weapon systems and so on that the military leadership itself says are useless, that cost billions and billions of dollars.
But certain members of Congress.
But certain members of Congress want. Imagine if you took the money out of those things and put it into the Universal Service Program. And I think that the long-term dividends of funding universal service would be much, much greater than funding anachronistic weapon systems that we don't need anymore the second they roll off the assembly line. So I mean, I think of course you're right that we're at a moment of fiscal austerity still, and we've got the sort of classic collective action problem of every member of Congress has a military base or a defense contractor in their constituency, and we continue to fund even things that don't make any sense because they provide jobs to real human beings, and I get that, and yet at the same time, it's not that there's too little money, it's that we're funding the wrong stuff, and we politically have not figured out how to break out of that pattern, I think.
Here, and then I'm going to move over here and get around. We still have time for, I hope, everybody.
Hi, I'm John Henry. The founders thought that war was the oldest and biggest problem in every generation, and the solution that they came up with was to make Congress the first branch. The executive was the second branch, and they put the war power in the Congress. Now, since we're 3 generations now into presidential wars, where essentially we've airbrushed out the most important power that Congress has. How do you think we can go about? I don't see a way we can basically deal with wars, all these 7 wars we got going in the Middle East. How can we shut these down? I don't see an Article 2 solution to this. I only see an Article 1 solution. But do you agree with that? And how do we get there?
I think there's been a pretty wholesale congressional abdication of its congressional responsibility to exercise meaningful oversight over military action. I think there are a lot of structural reasons for that. I mean, if I were in Congress, I would be pretty mad right now. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be. I mean, this again goes back to questions of what's hard because it's intellectually hard versus what's hard just because nobody has a political incentive to do it. And I think there is no inherent reason that Congress couldn't decide to wake up and take seriously their responsibilities and, for instance, craft a new authorization to use military force that was narrowly tailored to specific groups and regions, that had a sunset date, that had robust reporting requirements, and say to the administration, whichever administration it was, say, yes, we know this is inconvenient because things may change and you may feel that you need to use force somewhere else. It's supposed to be inconvenient. If there's a new group or a group has changed or the location has changed, then come back to us and ask for another one. And if you can make the case, we'll give it to you. There's no inherent reason Congress couldn't do that. I don't think it's a legislative crafting challenge that is sort of beyond the ability of members of Congress. I think the trouble is right now the situation in which responsibility is sort of nicely and pleasantly diffused between Congress and the executive branch from a political perspective, that everybody gets to take credit for successes and blame the other branch if something goes wrong, and nobody has the political incentive to change that, but I mean, this is, the dysfunctions of Congress are a whole other topic, and obviously not restricted to this.
We talk about that a lot here too.
Yeah, and not sadly restricted to this arena either. But no, you're right.
Here, please. Okay, bring the microphone to the front, and then we'll go back here.
Oda Aberdeen. Rosa, what lessons has the military learned from Vietnam, the Iraq War, the Afghan war?
What lessons has the military learned from everything from the Vietnam War to the more recent conflicts? I think the military is always learning and unlearning lessons. I think that the wrong post-Vietnam War lesson was learned. I think that sometimes people say the military is always fighting the last war, and I think, in fact, the military is always trying to forget the last war and go fight some different, better war in which everything is easier. I think that after the Vietnam War, the military forgot the lessons of counterinsurgency and messy conflicts and said, we only want to have nice, neat wars in which we can win decisively against a state enemy that fights the way we like them to fight, so e.g. the way that we could beat them easily. And then along came Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War, and he helpfully fought exactly the way the U.S. military wanted him to fight. And the U.S. military beat him soundly, at which point the U.S. military learned the lesson that it really likes to fight wars against actors who use conventional military force in the middle of the desert, and that it wanted to fight that kind of war, which we then tried to fight again in Iraq and Afghanistan, only to be confronted again with adaptive enemies that acted more like Vietnamese adversaries than like Saddam Hussein had acted in the first Gulf War. And there was a period of profound head-scratching and agonizing, at which point there was a resurgence of efforts to think seriously about legitimacy and counterinsurgency and stability operations, and that did lead to, in part, fueled this great expansion of military activities again, because the focus was on development and governance and so forth, and population protection, which then, as those wars became unpopular, the military then shifted back to, we just want to have drone strikes and high-tech war, because this stuff where there are lots of people in the middle of the desert didn't work out after all. So there's this kind of constant oscillation between actually, let me be more generous, actually, because I actually am very sympathetic to the dilemma that military leaders are experiencing right now. And that dilemma is that old-fashioned bloody war with bombs and property damage and tanks still exists and is not going to go away. So you have to be prepared to fight that kind of conflict, and you have to be prepared to fight potential conflicts against high-tech state adversaries. And yet at the same time, all these more diffuse, inchoate threats exist too, and you're trying to think about how to prepare for the cyber conflict or the next ISIS that pops up somewhere else, and that's really, really hard. In fact, it's impossible, because the military, I think, is struggling right now to figure out how do you do everything everywhere, and the answer is you can't. You can't be good at everything everywhere. You have to have some mechanism for deciding how to prioritize, for deciding which capabilities you're really going to need, where. And part of the problem right now is I don't think that the military has the sort of linguistic competence, the regional knowledge, the cultural competence to even do a very good job of thinking that through. And a lot about the structure of the assignment system within the military means that as soon as you become an expert on anything, you're rotated out of your job to go do something else. So it's really hard to institutionalize lessons, even if you know what the right lessons are. So I do think the military is a learning institution in a lot of ways, but there are all sorts of things about the way it is structured that make it hard to cement into place the lessons that it does sometimes want to learn.
Over here.
Mike Macetic, your comment about discussing with the major micro-lending. Since when do we send people to West Point to learn to manage micro-lending? Aren't we talking about a much bigger governmental problem typified by the fact that Rumsfeld carved the State Department out of post-war operations? Gates, on the other hand, wanted to create a much more robust civilian kind of operation to deal with things like microlending, rather than taking somebody who's gone through ranger training and expecting them to be a cultural, anthropological, microlending expert. Don't you need to get a much broader governmental look at how all this comes together?
Yeah, I think one casualty of the last few decades has been the civilian foreign policy institutions of the U.S. government, and I do think we're sort of in a vicious circle, as I said earlier, that the more you ask the military to do, the more you need to fund the military to do those things, so you look for savings elsewhere, so you freeze or cut the budgets of civilian foreign policy organizations, which means that their capabilities dwindle still further. So you look to the military to pick up the slack, and the cycle just starts repeating itself. I think that we have systematically semi-dismantled the State Department, USAID. It's often said, and it turns out to be true, somebody said the military music line earlier, but that there are more members of military marching bands than there are U.S. Foreign Service officers, and I thought, well, that can't be true. I looked it up, and in fact, it is true. But this makes sense, right? I mean, again, every member of Congress has a military base somewhere, or there's always going to be constituency lobbying for funding for the military. Nobody has a Foreign Service officer manufacturing plant in their backyard. So there's never a constituency pushing for that. And I do worry that we are at a point where, although we still like to sort of sit around in Washington and say to each other, oh, we need to rebalance, we need to move resources and authorities back to the civilian side, I do worry that we're at a point where it's sort of too late, that we have so damaged those institutions, and there is so little political will in Congress to change that it's not going to happen, which is why I come to the somewhat reluctant conclusion that we would do better to say, all right, the military, for better or for worse, the military is going to be doing this stuff, so let's figure out what we need to do to enable the military to do it well and do it responsibly.
And I have to come to the reluctant conclusion that our time is up. I want to thank Rosa Brooks again and tell all of you that she is going to be out signing her book. Thank you, and thank you, Rosa.
Thank you very much.